Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Okay, so anybody have any possibly paranormal experiences themselves? No creepypasta, just first-hands. Doesn't have to be a big story.
Regularly, my roommate and I experience strange occurrences in our trailer. One time in particular, I was playing live and he was in the kitchen washing dishes. We both heard what sounded like running, 4 or 5 steps. That came out of nowhere and disappeared into nowhere, right behind him in the kitchen. These were definitely the steps of a human, or something of equal size and stature. The dogs were in the living room sleeping, so it couldn't have been them. These mystery steps occur at least one time a week on average. Of course, it could happen a lot more often, seeing as how we're both at work for 10 hours a day. In addition to these mystery steps, there are also other things that remind me of a poltergeist. Objects fall or get pushed without anyone touching them. I've also experienced what felt like human fingers brushing across the back of my neck, but no one was there. This has happened to him as well.
Getting late, and this is the perfect thread to post in to keep me awake a little longer. I always wake up super early on Christmas, even though I'm an adult now. This won't be a great story, and has no end, but it's creepy as fuck to me and it's true. When I was small, I would often hear noises through the window to the outside of someone walking along a brick pathway beside our house. Sometimes I would see glowing red eyes too, and this would terrify me. At night, before going to bed, I could look out the windows and see red eyes staring from the shadows. If I checked back later, they'd still be there, or more often, have moved closer. If we were in the car at night, I could often spot the red eyes in a shadowy location, watching as we drove by. This pattern of red eyes, and occasionally hoods with red eyes, didn't stop as I grew older, however. When I would look out of the windows at night, they would still come closer and closer. The terror culminated while staying at my grandfather's house one night. I had seen the red eyes, approaching as ever. I slept on the couch, no guest bedroom. At some point in the night I woke up, opened my eyes, and saw someone standing over me in a full-length brown cloak, face indistinguishable from shadow, glowing red eyes leering into mine, and a large, bloody knife being held over my chest. I was so utterly terrified that I couldn't make any noise. I clenched my eyes shut to get away from the eyes and trembled, waiting to die. Why was the knife already bloody? But I didn't die, and when I opened my eyes again, nothing was there. Though such a close encounter with the source of the eyes was singular, I've continued to see them even unto today. If I went outside right now and sat on my porch, chances are that they'd eventually show up, and along with them true fear, the kind that moves up and down your back and into the head. In the dark I can feel a presence, always. If I'm sitting on my porch, or looking through a window, or driving down an unlit and sparsely driven road, I'll see the eyes at some juncture. If I stand outside in the darkness alone, I never see the eyes because they are approaching me from behind. And if I turn suddenly, I will usually catch a glimpse of movement. The existence of the eyes has never seemed any less real, and I'm completely perplexed as to why this is happening. What is the purpose of the eyes watching me? The knife was already bloodied when I woke to see the entity standing over me. I've told other people about this, but it's like they don't hear me. It's not that they dismiss what I'm saying, it's as if I never said it. They don't say, "Oh, there's nothing there," or, "It's just your imagination." This lack of reaction is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of my delusion, the phenomenon I've experienced and endured for so many years. As I said, no end and none foreseen.
I live in a small little residential town in the middle of the Mojave Desert, Antelope Valley in Southern California. It's called Lake LA and was built over an Indian burial ground. When I was about 2, my aunt told me she saw a large, black figure walking from my mom's room across the hall to what used to be my room before I moved out. Then in 2004, the cupboard door in the bathroom, closest to the door, was opening and slamming on its own on the 3rd of July. It did this all night, with a few pauses of maybe about 5-10 minutes. Also, when I was 3 or 4, I was sleeping in my mom's room and she had already left for work. She worked the early shift and left around 2 a.m. I was woken up by a lot of voices. My mom's room was messy and there was a lot of papers and letter and such on the floor. I could hear them rustling around as if there were people walking around the room, but there was nothing there. Last thing I can remember was when I was 6. I was woken up by what sounded like a pow-wow, Native American dance. There's an Indian museum on the butte behind my mom's house, and they had pow-wow festivals a couple times a year, and it looked like there was a camp-type fire outside my window. Y'all know, the orange glow and stuff. When I opened the blinds there was nothing there and everything stopped. This happened a few times that night, and I even woke my aunt up to have her look, but like before, there was nothing out there. The next day there was a broken stone arrowhead outside my window that looked very, very old, that hadn't been there before. Not really creepy, but still paranormal. One year, at one of the pow-wows during summer in the middle of a really, really bad draft, the Native American shaman did a rain dance. He said give it 3 days and there would be rain. Sure enough, 3 days later there was rain. And the weather forecast for that third morning said it would be a hot, dry day. It poured down buckets.
My mother told me that when I was about 5 or so, I would look up at the corners of the ceiling, laughing hysterically at something that she couldn't see. When she asked me what it was, I apparently said, "The green guy. He's popping in and out of the walls." She would have just ignored this, but our dog also watched the ceiling and the walls with me. So, not that creepy, but I played peekaboo with a ghost once. Also, there is a footprint in our house that is practically a burn mark. The stain is so dark. It's nowhere near any doors or anything that could make a stain. The foot is a perfect footprint, and is not the size of any of the people who come to our house, and it was not there when we moved into the house. When our cats walk past it, they kind of avoid it, and I don't know where it came from or what made it, but I get the feeling that it was a shadow person.
When I was younger, I woke up in the middle of the night, because it had become absurdly cold for no reason. I looked out my door and into the hallway, where I saw a small pale kid with no face who seemed as startled by me as I was of it. It slowly backed towards the bathroom, where a larger figure with no face came out of the bathroom mirror, and embraced the smaller one, and they both slowly backed into the bathroom back through the mirror with the little one waving "goodbye" in my direction. When they had faded from sight, my door slammed so hard it rattled the windows in my room. My mom came in to see what had happened, and tried to convince me it was only a dream, but I still know to this day I was fully awake when it happened.
I work alone in a building with an alarm system that causes the 2 entrance doors to beep when opened. During the 2 hours I'm there alone, no one comes in. Every so often someone will try to go to the office, which I'm in, surfing X, and trying not to jerk off out of boredom, but the door is locked, so I pretend I'm alone. Every so often, though, I'll hear what sounds like the door closing even though it never opened to begin with. The building only has 1 hallway with 3 locked rooms, 1 unlocked fitness room, and 1 unlocked bathroom, so I can piss, so I am absolutely certain when the place is empty. On top of the weird door noises, I've also heard people talking in voiced too low for me to understand. It could be people outside of the doors, but I'd see them on the security camera, and no one comes around the building anyway. Twice I've even called out to see if anyone can hear me, to be met with silence. A coworker joked about the place being haunted and hearing voices. And my boss said the same thing, so I'm not the only one who has experienced this. While I'm not 100% the place is haunted, whatever, it is still some weird shit.
I once went on a very supernatural bow hunt in the upper part of my state. Started off normal enough. I drove my truck in and set up my tent and camp in general. Unloaded my horses and secured them between two trees in the usual fashion. At the end of the day, I had a hot cup of coffee and cooked myself some steak and eggs and dozed off. I woke up the next day, cooked breakfast, took a couple practice shots at a target I brought with me to warm up, and set off. This is when things started to get creepy. I walked up some of the usual game trails, and all day I didn't find anything. No fresh sign, no bugles, and not a single sign of the elk that were usually in the area. I attributed it to the fact that there had been a large hunt before mine and went back to camp. When I got there, my horses were yanking at their tether and seemed more than a little spooked. I also dismissed this, thinking they were just restless. So, I put my pack down and brought them to a nearby stream to drink. At first they wouldn't drink at all. They only stared into the woods. I eventually got them to drink, but every now and again they would suddenly look up, very alert, as if there was something in the woods. After getting back to camp, one cooked dinner and went to sleep, as per usual. The next day I ventured out with the same luck. No sign of elk at all. Only this time I noticed nothing else was making noise. No birds chirping. No chipmunks chittering. It was like the forest was dead. I went back to camp a little discouraged and followed the normal routine. The horses were even more spooked and acting strange. Now that night was really riveting. No matter how I try to explain it, something just don't add up. I went to bed and was awoken in the middle of the night to my horses screaming and thrashing around. I grabbed my sidearm and went outside in my underwear. There were tracks all over my camp. Like something had been wandering around messing with things, and more often than not they stopped where there was a window on my tent to ventilate smoke, which was half open. The horses were absolutely terrified and everything outside was knocked over. The weirdest thing yet was my target, which I had been practicing with twice every day, was gone. I was a little spooked, but attributed it to camp thieves and went back to sleep with my sidearm close by. The next day I secured everything safely in my tent and took a look around camp before heading out. My horses never stopped staring at the woods. It was a cold day and still the forest was dead. I was taking a hike up one of the normal game trails I hunted on, and suddenly I stopped. Sitting right there in the middle of the trail was my practice target. It was just sitting there set up like I had it in camp when I shot at it. I examined the target but refused to carry it back to camp with me. I simply set it off the trail and returned to camp, more than a little spooked. I tried to water my horses, but they absolutely refused to move from where they stood or even go near the woods. This is when I started to realize there really was something out there. That night my fears were soothed a bit when I heard coyotes outside howling, which would explain my spooked horses. Later that night I awoke to a bunch of coyotes screeching. They were obviously playing, so I went back to bed. I woke up the next day and tried a different area, a small ravine I had left untouched so far. About halfway up the ravine I heard something move away from me, breaking a stick or two and moving rather fast as it went. This really upped my spirits. I had just spooked an elk. I stalked it for the rest of that day but never caught up to it. I went to bed that night with high spirits and decided to stay another day despite all that had happened. I awoke that next day and went to that same ravine. I stalked it for several hours before I caught sign of movement. Something bolted away from me up onto the ridge. I only caught a glimpse of it, but it looked to have a tan hide. Needless to say, I went after it. I hiked up onto the ridge as quietly as I could, and the wind was also in my favor. It was the best stalk I had ever made. As I reached the top of the ridge, I heard something circling around in some oak bushes just beyond a group of trees. Perfect. I would have a great shot on the only elk I had encountered the entire hunt. It couldn't have been more than 40 yards beyond the group of trees. I snuck up to the trees as quietly as I could, hiding myself between the last tree. I nocked an arrow and began to pivot around the tree when I froze dead in my tracks. Partway around the tree was the carcass of not one, but 2 coyotes. This definitely brought me back to reality, and I was suddenly very afraid. I had no idea what was on the other side of that tree. I took a befuddled step backward and made a critical error. I snapped a fallen branch behind me. I froze, afraid to do anything else, and the circling stopped as well. There was silence for several more moments, when I heard whatever was on the other side of that tree start to silently creep towards me. There was no question about what to do. I bolted. I hightailed it out of that ravine as fast as I could, thinking I heard something behind me the whole way. Could have been paranoia though. I got back to camp and packed up as fast as I could and left, looking over my shoulder the whole time. When I got home, my wife hugged me with tears in her eyes. Apparently, someone on that hunt had died in a hunting accident, but their name wasn't released. I never did find out what was on the other side of that tree.
The old house I grew up in scared the crap out of me. It's hard to say if it was really paranormal or just my overactive child imagination, but yeah. Various things. I used to have horrible nightmares about shadow people when living in that house. It was almost like they invaded my dreams, because most of them would be seemingly normal dreams. One in particular I remember was me and some friends playing hide and go seek in my house. But suddenly, everyone in my dream would disappear and I'd get this serious feeling of dread, and then they'd appear. I'd usually wake up right after that. These went on for years, and only stopped once I moved out of that house. Also, other weird things happened. I remember once our refrigerator started shaking violently when we were all in the basement watching TV. My parents told me it was an earthquake, but yeah, those don't usually happen in the Midwest. Also, I remember one night I was thrown into hysterics after something whistled, like human-made whistle, directly into my ear, twice. Not to mention the Native American one saw in my bedroom. But I was just waking up and it could have been a lucid dream.
At my workplace, I work in the kitchen at the BP's in town. There is evidence of an entity that many of the people working there are starting to call Mr. Polty. He'll tug waitresses' aprons off, knock orders down and off shelves. According to some of the managers, he'll walk around at night, making noises, yanking bathroom chains, flushing toilets randomly. However, the ones who notice him the most are the cooks. They'll randomly hear a printer going off, and nothing's there. My account with Mr. Polty is rather mundane. As So Happy Together done by some punk band came on, I said out loud to one of my teammates, "Is it me or am I really just starting to hate punk covers?" Mr. Polty's activities were a bit more active that night, having already yanked one of the waitress's aprons off. Pull cord, let fall. But not 30 seconds after I said that, the music changed. I said, "Thank you, whomever did that." The only person nearby the music button called out, "But it wasn't me." Which I said, "But seriously. Thank you. It wasn't me." Yeah, rather mundane, but still.
Back at my first job, movie theater, Uptown Theater, owned my landmark. I was asked to come in early to clean the theaters as the janitor was given the day off. I cleaned 1 or 2 of the 4 theaters, leaving Giant 1 till last, and my boss walked in and said, "I'm going out for a coffee for about an hour." His daughter was with him. About half an hour later I heard this big booming laugh coming from the projector room. A bunch of the people who work there, have worked there have tons of stories about it, but it's mostly just hearing walking around the projectors. Not paranormal, but it was funny for me, scary for the chick. She was up in the office doing some paperwork and I ran past the office to grab some candies. She just saw a shadow and didn't really think about it. I hopped in front of the door off some stairs to ask her a question and she freaked out.
I was something like 10 to 12 when this happened. I was out with my friends at night, when it was completely dark outside. We took flashlights and went to this huge forest, to play hide and seek in the dark. I went and run to hide behind this big tree, when I suddenly saw something in the corner of my eye. I pointed my light at it, and it looked like there was this very small person there, dressed in all white, bending down, like searching for something from the ground. Its back was facing me, so I didn't see its face. I don't remember it having any hair, or if it did, that was probably all white too. It was honestly about the size of a cat, so I freaked, because no normal human is that small. I looked away, to see where my friends are, but when I looked back and it was gone. Don't know if I was just seeing things, but it did scare my friends when I told them about it afterwards.
Other than the usual little things that pretty much everyone on here's experienced, I can remember 3 very distinct instances where I've experienced what I consider the paranormal. 1. A few years back in that space just after high school graduation and just before going off to college, I was heading out to pick up a friend at about 8, 9 at night. At the time I didn't have my own car, so I had to head out back to use my mother's minivan. We live in a fairly well-populated neighborhood, have neighbors across the backyard, but there's some tall evergreens that screen our yard from theirs. I hadn't had a problem with walking out there at night before, other than when I was very young and didn't like the dark. But it was odd. The minute I walked out the door that night, the whole area just felt wrong. It was fine inside the house just a second ago, and I look at the grouping of evergreens and I got the impression that whatever it was that was giving off this horrid presence was in there, but there wasn't anything visibly there. Anyway, I try to brush the feeling off, and take a few steps towards the car, when suddenly I just stopped moving. It was like I was frozen to the spot, with this horrible wrong feeling all around me, pressing in on me. That's when it felt like whatever it was had suddenly taken notice of me, rooting me to the spot with its gaze. I had an impression of how it looked now in my head, though I generally believe that was probably just my mind going into oh shit mode. I'll describe it later if anyone's interested. Anyways, I stand like that for a while, dropping enough bricks to add a new wing to the house behind me, before managing to override my panic and bolt for the car. Whatever it was continued to watch me. I slammed the door shut, and tried to turn the car on. In the car, trying to get keys in ignition, which is not easy to do when you're shaking hard. But the worst part was, when I was trying to jam the keys in the start, whatever it was walked up to the car, and was now peering in the driver's side window. There was nothing visibly there still, but I knew it was pressing its eyes against the window, not doing anything to me, just watching with an intensity that made my stomach turn. I started the car, managed not to smack into the corner of our garage, and hauled ass out of there nearly in tears. I picked my friend up, we drove around a while to let me rant and settle down, and when I drove back, whatever it was gone, but my friend said the air felt odd, like it was buzzing with energy. That's the first encounter I ever had. The next 2 aren't as scary, at least not to me, but still pretty worthy. 2. A while after that, I was sitting at my computer in the room that faces the backyard where the previous unseeable thing had been. I had heard some scurrying and scratching around outside the back screen door, and the porch light was on as well. I didn't see anything out there, but we had a lot of chipmunks and squirrels living around outhouse, so I just assumed it was some of them running around after dark. Anyway, I got up and closed the inner main door that sits behind the screen, and locked it for the night. I sat back down at the computer, and not more than 5 minutes later, this ungodly low, guttural growl comes from right inside the now closed door. The hair went up on the back of my neck and I bolted for my room. I slammed my shoulder so hard against the corner of the doorway it bruised up black the next day, but it didn't even slow me down that night. I ran in my room, got my boot knife and got my dad, but nothing was outside or in the house. Thankfully, I never heard anything like that again, and dear God, I hope I never do. And finally, my third and last major paranormal experience. I was in Indiana at the time, and my grandmother had just had a stroke which she would some 2 or so weeks later die from. I had flown up with my mother to visit my grandmother while she still had some conscious brain function left, to hopefully help her recovery, and generally just support other members of the family. It was just my mother and I at the time, as my father had to stay at home for work, and my sister was off at college. Anyway, we had been at the hospital pretty much off and on all day, staying either by her side or hanging out with family there or at my aunt's nearby house. It had been a long, painful day, and so my mother and I crashed when we got to the hotel. Incidentally, we were either in or next to the room my grandmother had had her stroke in the day before. Weird. Anyway, I wasn't really all that tired, since I'd slept on the plane and a bit at my aunt's house, so I wasn't surprised when I woke up in the middle of the night. However, I heard my mother muttering and grinding her teeth in her sleep in the bed next to mine, and leaned halfway out of mine to poke at her to make her stop it, as it was pretty damn creepy muttering. I couldn't get her to stop, and I was just going to flop back down in bed when I caught something in motion out of the corner of my eye. I slowly turned my head, and watched as this human-sized shadow figure glided across the floor in front of our beds. It stopped at the head of our beds in the space between them, and just stood there. Other than a defined head and shoulder shape, it just went straight down to the floor in a curtain of dark. I have never seen anything as dark as this. It was like it somehow pulled light away from the edges around it, even in the pitch-black room we were in. I stared at it a moment, then began to reach my hand up defensively just in case, when it seemed to become startled, and bolted out the window. The rest is pretty much typical. My mother would not wake up enough for me to explain what I saw. She did stop the creepy muttering though. We stayed there a few more days, and on the day we left, not long after we had left her side, my grandmother slipped out of consciousness and never came back out of it. She died about a week later, but peacefully, and surrounded by my mother's 3 sisters. We had gone home that very day, thinking she would hold on long enough for us to get home and back again. So, that's pretty much it for me. Other stuff happened, but it's just little things and nothing that people don't already post pretty frequently about on here.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.